Assalamu alaikum everyone, this is Mufti Mudasir, Professor at the Department of English, University of Kashmir. And in today's video we are going to talk about Mirza Asadullah Khan Ghalib, the celebrated poet of Urdu and Persian who lived from 1797 to 1869. In this video I will be talking about Ghalib's fascination with Persian language and why he preferred to be called a poet of Persian rather than Urdu. In the course of this video, we'll be discussing some important things which I think are important to understand Ghalib's mindset and his attitude towards Persian and also Urdu, and especially his attitude towards his predecessors, the great masters whom he acknowledges in his poetry. So let us begin. In one of the Persian verses, Ghalib says this about himself. He says, بود غالب اندلیب از گلستان عجم من ز غفلت طوطی هندوستان نامیدمش, which means Ghalib was a nightingale from the Persian garden, but I was mistaken to call him a parrot of India. So let us look at why Ghalib calls himself a nightingale from the Persian garden rather than a parrot of India. And this is just one of the verses where Ghalib speaks of himself in this way. We will be talking about his fascination with Persian language, his desire to be counted as one of the great Persian poets of all time, and his complaint against his contemporaries that they are not able to recognize his true merit and true worth. In another verse, Ghalib responds to his rival Ibrahim Zauq, who was his rival at the court of Bahadur Shah Zafar. And Ibrahim Zauq had said something about Ghalib's Urdu poetry which Ghalib did not like. And in response, Ghalib says, Farsi bin tabibini nakshhai rang rang bugzar az majmue Urdu ki bhi rang manast, which means, look to my Persian to see myriad colored constructions. Skip my Urdu collection, my bland achievement. Now, why did Ghalib think that his Urdu was not as good as his Persian? There were reasons for that. To begin with, we must understand that Persian was still a very prestigious language at the time when Ghalib was writing. It was a cosmopolitan language with a literary tradition, with a venerable literary tradition of more than 800 years. And it had produced great poets from Sanai and Anwari and Khaqani and Attar and Hafiz, and hundreds of poets belong to this great tradition. As against this, Urdu was relatively a new language. It was called Rekhta, a mixed language. It was a vernacular, and it could not boast of a literary tradition of more than 200 years. So if a poet really wanted to have prestige and to be known in the larger Persian-speaking world, he need to write Persian very well, and Ghalib always wanted to do that and to have that kind of reputation. We move on. Ghalib wants to be seen as one of the greatest poets of all times, one of the greatest Persian poets of all times, but he finds his desire is frustrated because his contemporaries do not recognize his worth and his merit as a Persian poet. So this raises, embitters him, and he time and again comes to this theme in his Persian poetry. For example, this verse, Girifta khatir Ghalib ze Hindu ayanash baran sarast ki aware ajam gardad. Fed up of India and its notables, Ghalib wishes to go wandering in Persia. And look at this verse, غالب ذهن نیست نوایی که می کشیم گویی ز اصفهان و هرات و قمیم ما. Ghalib, the songs I sing are not from India. You could say I'm from Isfahan or Herat or Qum. So we are already seeing that Ghalib is almost regretting why he is born in India. And he has a complaint against his contemporaries, as I said. And in this verse he also comes to the same theme. Tu eki mehve sukhan gustaran peshini mabash munkir Ghalib ki dar zamane tust. O you so engrossed in the poets of a bygone age, don't turn away from Ghalib because he lives in yours. So the fact that he lives, he's a later day poet, as Harold Bloom would call such poets who come at a later point in tradition, does not mean that he's any less than the earlier great poets of Persian tradition. And not only against his contemporaries, Ghalib also has a complaint against God, because he thinks that he is born in a wrong place. And this verse suggests this: غالب سوخت جان را چه به گفتار آری به دیاری که ندانن نظیری ز قتیل. Why did you inspire Ghalib? Is this addressed to God? Why did you inspire Ghalib, a burnt soul, to say verses in a land where they can't tell Naziri from Qatil? Now, Naziri was one of the greatest poets of the Indian style of writing, and Qatil was a third-rate scholar of Persian. And Ghalib had a very bitter experience when he entered into a very acrimonious dispute with the followers of Qatil in his stay of Calcutta. So he thinks that his Indian contemporaries really do not understand him well, and that's why he goes back to these poets and he remembers them fondly in his Persian divan. I will name a few poets and say a few things about them who often find mention in Ghalib's Persian divan. One of them is Urfi Shirazi, a very famous poet of Akbar's court. And Urfi, as perhaps some of you know, was a very famed poet at Akbar's court who died at a very young age of 36. By that time, he had already made a mark as one of the greatest poets of that age. And Urfi is also known to Kashmiris because when Akbar conquered Kashmir in 1586, Urfi actually wrote a qasida on Kashmir, actually celebrating Akbar's conquest of Kashmir. And it has a very famous opening. Har sukh ta jane ki ba Kashmir ayad, agar murg kabab ast be balo par ayad, which means that every anguished soul who comes to Kashmir will grow wings and fly, even if it is a roasted bird. And Abdul Qadir Badayuni, the famous historian, tells us that Urfi was so famous that in every street booksellers used to display his divan. And he enjoyed great prestige at Akbar's court before he died at a very young age. And Urfi's poetry has also influenced Iqbal, who wrote a poem on Urfi and also used some of his verses as Tazmeen. So Urfi is one poet that Ghalib remembers. We'll come to that in a moment, what he has to say about Urfi and how he uses his poetry, grafting it into his own verses. Another important poet that Ghalib remembers is Naziri Nishapuri. Naziri left Iran and he came to India, of course in search of patronage, as was a very common thing in those days. And he joined the court of the Mughal statesman Abdurrahim Khani Khanan. Khani Khanan, as you know, those who know history, he was the son of Bairam Khan and a very important noble in Mughal India. And it was through it was through Khani Khanan that Naziri came to know Akbar, although he did not join the imperial court. There is an interesting reference in one of the qasidas of Naziri where he criticizes Akbar for his innovations in religion, especially with reference to Deen-e-Ilahi. And there was also some interesting anecdotes have been passed on which tell us about the rivalry among the poets. And Urfi and Naziri also were rivals. And Naziri actually criticizes Urfi for his arrogance in one of his qasidas. But a more interesting rivalry is between Urfi and Fazi. Fazi, as you know, was a celebrated courtier in Akbar's court. He was Abul Fazl's brother and son of a very famous scholar called Sheikh Mubarak. So there is an anecdote that has been quoted in several works of history that one day Fazi was playing with a puppy of his and Urfi happened to pass by, and Urfi asked Fazi, "What's its name?" And Fazi said, "Urfi." And Urfi replied, "Mubarak Bashad," which means two things simultaneously. Mubarak Bashad means congratulations, but Mubarak Bashad also means it should have been Mubarak, leaving Fazi to wonder whether he meant the first one or the second one. But of course, we know the Urfi had a point. He wanted to, refer to his father. And anyway, another poet that Ghalib talks about was Zahuri Turshizi. Zahuri Turshizi came to India and he entered the service of Nizam Shahis in Ahmednagar. Later on, he joined the court of Bijapur and he became a very important figure there in the court of Adil Shahis. And he found a very great patron whom Ghalib would talk about in his poetry, and his name was Ibrahim Adil Shah. And Zahuri features more than any other poet, more than any other Persian poet. Ghalib talks about Zahuri. Another poet was Talib Amuli, who had traveled from Iran in search of patronage, and somehow after a long struggle he had found a way into Jahangir's court. Another one was Sahib Tabrizi, and Sahib Tabrizi is known because we have Tazkira writers saying that he came to Kashmir, and it's historically established that he came to Kashmir. But Tazkira writers would say that he came to ask Ghani of the meaning of the word Kralapan, which Ghani had used in one of his verses and which Sahib could not understand. Another poet that Ghalib talks about is Ali Hazin, and we will try to look at what Ghalib has to say about them. The first thing is that Ghalib acknowledged his debt to them, and in his Persian divan there are of course thousands of verses, but there is an afterword also. In that afterword, he has something interesting to say about these poets. Ghalib says that I was able to woo their spirits, and I was able to convince them to be my masters in the path of poetry, to be my guides in the path of poetry. He adds that in the beginning of my journey as a poet, I had tended to get strayed, here and there. I had tended to mistake idiosyncrasies for originality. But they came and they stopped me and they showed me the right path. And I was rescued by their gracious souls. And he calls himself a fellow traveler who is treading the same path as they. And then at one point he says this is written in beautiful Persian prose: کلک رقاص من به خرامش تدرو است و به رامش موسیقار به جلو طاووس است و به پرواز عنقا. Which means, my dancing pen is now a cock pheasant in gait, a musical bird in singing, a peacock in glory, and a phoenix in flight. And this idea that one has to follow the path shown by the great predecessors, it is one of the important themes in Ghalib's poetry. In an advice that he gives to a younger poet, Ghalib says, هرز مشتاب و پی راه شناسان بردار ای که در راه سخن چون تو هزار آمد و رفت. Which means, O you who are on the journey of verse making, don't rush into every direction. Follow the path of those who know it well, for countless have come before you and gone. Now, in order to understand this relationship that Ghalib cultivates between himself and his predecessors, we have to understand various ways of intertextual engagement in Persian ghazal. And here are some important things that students and readers of Ghalib should know. There is one concept called tazmeen, which means quoting directly from another poet. Jawab goi, which is writing response poems. There is istiqbal, which literally means welcoming, but actually it means the practice of reworking the theme of an earlier ghazal but retaining its formal structure. And tasarruf, which literally means appropriation, and actually means altering a word or text altering a word or two of a text. Now, it is important to make it simpler. It is important to keep in mind what zameen is meant. in ghazal. Every ghazal is written in a zameen, and zameen refers to the meter, the rhyme, and the end rhyme. The beher, the qafiya, and radif of a ghazal. And it very often used to happen, especially in that age of Sabke Hindi, that poets used to write response poems to earlier poets, and this was done to show that they could write as well as the other great poets. Let us look at some illustrations of how Ghalib remembers them, because I have begun by saying that Ghalib remembers them fondly, he pays his tribute to them, and he acknowledges their greatness. But this is all done in order to show that he also belongs to that line of poets, and he should be seen as one among them. This is what Ghalib says about Zahuri. Mara madad zifaz Zahuri ast dar sukhan chun jam badarat bekhare khumim ma. In poetry, I look to Zahuri's abundance for sustenance, like the wine cup which draws constantly from the jar. Here is another verse of Zahuri, of Ghalib about Zahuri. Barnazmo Nasre Maulana Zahuri Zinda Am Ghalib, Ragejan Karda Am Shiraz Awrake Kitab Ashra. The prose and poetry of Zahuri keep me alive, Ghalib. With my jugular vein, I have bound his scattered pages. And here is another one. Zalla Bardare Zahuri Bash Ghalib Behas Chist Dar Sukhan Darwish Bayad Na Dukandari. Grab victuals from Zahuri's table. Victuals is food. Grab victuals from Zahuri's table, Ghalib. Why dispute? In poetry, one needs to be a beggar, not a shopkeeper. And here is another one. Ghalib Bashir comes Zahuri Nayam Wali Adil Shahe Sukhan Rasse Darya Nawal Ku. Ghalib, in poetry I am no less than Zahuri, but where is my Adil Shah, that bountiful connoisseur of verse? Meaning that I am no less than Zahuri as far as poetic prowess and poetic talent is concerned, but I don't have the same good fortune of having a patron like Ibrahim Adil Shah that Zahuri had. Ghalib az man shevaye nutqe Zahuri zindagasht, az nawa jan dar tane saze bayanash karda am. Ghalib, the style of Zahuri's speech lives through me. My songs infuse life in the tune of his expressions. So this was about Zahuri, and in this one verse that I am quoting now, he talks about Saib and Zahuri together. Zauke fikr Ghalib ra burd-az anjuman birun, ba Zahuri o Saib mehve ham zabani hast. Flair for deep reflection put Ghalib out of the gathering, and now he is busy conversing with Zahuri and Saib. Meaning that my Indian contemporaries could not understand me because the complexity of meaning was beyond their grasp. So my flair for deep reflection, my flair for searching for very intricate meanings, it put me out of the gathering. But it proved to be a blessing in disguise, because now I am in the company of the great ones like Zahuri and Saib. And this also Ghalib talks about in his verses, that poetic theme should be complex, which demands some kind of reflection and contemplation. Sukhane sauda dilam ra nafari bad Ghalib, nuktaye chand az pechida bayani biman or. Which means, a plain verse does not delight my heart, Ghalib. Bring me a few complex constructions. And this was about Zahuri and Saib. Now let us look at what Ghalib has to say about Urfi. This is one beautiful verse about Urfi. Chun nanazad sukhan az marhamate dahr bakhish ki baru Urfi o Ghalib ba iwaz baz dahad. Why shouldn't poetry be proud when time has favored it, giving it the likes of Urfi and Ghalib as recompense? Here is another one. Kaifiyate Urfi talab az teenate Ghalib, jame digaran bade Shiraz nadarad. Looking for Urfi's magic? Is asking the reader, are you looking for Urfi's magic? Seek it from Ghalib's genius. Others' goblets do not contain the wine of Shiraz. So let us look at Ghalib's response to Urfi. how does Ghalib use Urfi's verses, and how does he, by just changing a few words or by adding his own misra to Urfi's misra, how he creates a new poem. This is one poem where Ghalib does so. This is Urfi's verse. Hum samandar basho hum mahi kidar jihon ishq ruye darya salsabilo qare darya atashast. The translation: be both a salamander and a fish, for the sea of love is such that the surface is salsabil and its bottom fire. Now, there are a few allusions here. Salamander is a mythical animal, a lizard-like animal which is believed to live and thrive in fire. And salsabil is a very famous stream of paradise. And Urfi's verse is about love. So he's saying that the experiences of love is such that on the surface it looks like salsabil. Ruye darya is salsabil, the surface is salsabil, but its bottom is like fire. So a lover needs to be both like a fish and like a salamander. Now, how does Ghalib rework this verse? How does he use Urfi's verse but gives it a different meaning, gives it a twist? Bi khatar, this is Ghalib's verse. Bi khatar dar bala budan behaz bime bala qare darya salsabilo ruye darya atashast. To dive fearlessly into a calamity is better than living in its constant fear, for the bottom of the sea is salsabil and its surface fire. So what is Ghalib doing? First of all, Urfi's verse is about the experience of love, but Ghalib's verse is a more general experience, it's more general, it's not restricted to the experience of love. He is saying that the fear of calamity is worse than the calamity itself, and in order to prove it, he gives this explanation. He says that qare darya salsabilo ruye darya atashast. The bottom of the sea is salsabil and its surface is fire. So it's by inverting what Urfi had said that Ghalib produces a new verse. And look at this verse of Urfi. Qafiya gar yaftam mukarrar bastam garman farhang budami chigam masti. So Urfi is saying is talking about his search for qafiyas, for rhymes. If I stumble on a rhyme, I use it repeatedly. I would have had no worry if I were a dictionary. He expresses his wish, if I were a dictionary, then I would not have had these worries. Look at Ghalib. Qafiya chunist Ghalib purs zi urfi. And look at the layers of meaning that are in this verse. Qafiya chunist Ghalib purs zi urfi garman farhang budami chigam masti. If rhyme eludes you, Ghalib, ask Urfi. Now this is Ghalib's misra, but the second misra is Urfi's misra. Agar man farhang budami chigam maste. I would have had no worry if I were a dictionary. So how is Ghalib producing something more fantastic, more delightful than Urfi? Because the informed reader knows in what context Urfi has used this verse. He has expressed his inability to find appropriate verses, or the number of qafiyas that he requires, the number of rhymes that he requires, and that's why he says that if I find a good rhyme, I use it on and on, I use it repeatedly, and then he expresses his wish that I wish I were a dictionary. Ghalib is using Urfi's verse, but giving it a new twist, giving it a new meaning. He is saying that Qafiya chunist Ghalib purzi Urfi. If you don't find appropriate rhymes, ask Urfi. But then when he comes to this, agar man farhang budami chigam maste, the reader knows that Ghalib is being ironical here. He is saying that even Urfi had to struggle to find appropriate rhymes, and reading those verses of Ghalib and Urfi together enables the reader to see the beauty of Ghalib's verse. Now coming to Ghalib and Naziri Nishapuri. Naziri's verse is Mara basada dili hai man tavan bakshid khata namuda amu chashme afrin daram, which means I can be forgiven for my many innocent acts. I display my wrongdoing and wait for an applause. It's a beautiful verse. He's saying that on the day of judgment, most probably referring to the day of judgment, God will forgive me because of my innocent act. And one of those innocent acts, I have many innocent acts, and one of those is that on the day of judgment, I will display my wrongdoing and I will expect appreciation. I will expect applause. And what does Ghalib say? Ghalib says, Jawab Khaje Naziri Nivishta am Ghalib Khata Namud Amo Chashme Afrin Daram. I have written my response to Master Naziri. I display my wrongdoing and wait for an applause. What Ghalib is actually saying is that this is my wrongdoing. But he's being ironical. He's saying that I'm writing a response to Naziri Nishapuri. And Jawab Khaje Naziri Nivishta am Ghalib. And what is that? Khata Namud Amo Chashme Afrin Daram. That I display my wrongdoing and expect an applause. Meaning that I have the audacity, I have the cheek to write a response poem to someone as great as Naziri. And this is his khata. But actually what Ghalib means to say is that read the two poems together and you will see that my poem is no less inferior, in no way inferior to that of Naziri. Now, students of English literature know that T.S. Eliot in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, talked about the need to cultivate the tradition. And his criticism of originality is also well known to the students. How a poet needs to cultivate that sense of the tradition in order to become a successful poet. As Eliot says, for all those who want to continue writing poetry beyond their 25th birthday. And there are interesting parallels, one could say, between Eliot's idea and how Ghalib's theory and Ghalib's practice. I will end on this quote by Coleridge, who wrote in Table Talk, "A poet ought not to pick nature's pocket. Let him borrow, and so borrow as to repay in the very act of borrowing." And I think Ghalib repays his great Persian predecessors in the very act of borrowing. Thank you.